What if everything you think you know about Star Wars is wrong? Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, deliberately wrong. What if the prophecy that defines the entire saga was misread by the Jedi for 1,000 years? What if Anakin Skywalker was never born? He was built. What if the woman who raised him never stood a chance because the child growing inside her had already been claimed by something far darker than fate? These are not idle questions. They are the threads that, once pulled, unravel almost everything you believe about this galaxy. Stay with that feeling for a moment. The feeling that something is off, that the story you grew up with has gaps nobody bothered to explain. Because tonight, we are going to walk straight into those gaps, one at a time, and see what's actually hiding inside them. Some of what you hear will feel obvious in hindsight, the kind of thing you can't unsee once it's pointed out. Some of it will feel unsettling, the kind of thing that recolors a character you thought you understood completely. All of it connects. All of it builds toward a version of this saga stranger and more deliberate than the one on screen. So let your guard down. Let the noise of the day fall away. We're not here to rush through plot points you already know. We're here to go underneath them, into the quiet architecture nobody talks about, the kind of mist that settles slow and stays. We begin with a question that has haunted careful viewers for decades. What if the prophecy of the Chosen One was never actually about destroying the Sith in the way everyone assumed? The official line, repeated by Jedi Masters across generations, was simple enough on its face. A being would come, born of unusual circumstances, who would bring balance to the Force by ending the Sith and restoring the natural order. It sounds clean. It sounds like the kind of prophecy you would expect from an ancient religious order convinced of its own righteousness. But prophecies in mythology are rarely so straightforward. And the Jedi, for all their wisdom, were notoriously bad at interpreting their own scripture. Consider what balance actually means. Not the eradication of darkness, but the equilibrium between light and dark. A structure where neither side overwhelms the other. If that is the true meaning, then Anakin Skywalker did not fail the prophecy by falling to the dark side and becoming Darth Vader. He fulfilled it. By becoming the very embodiment of the dark side's power within a single being, and then by destroying the Emperor at the moment of his own redemption, he didn't simply remove the Sith from the equation. He balanced the scales by experiencing both extremes within himself and ultimately choosing neither pure light nor pure dark, but something in between. A being who loved his son more than he feared his master. The galaxy was not freed from darkness when Vader died. It was freed from imbalance. The Force itself, if we treat it as something closer to a living, breathing entity rather than an impersonal energy field, may have required a vessel capable of experiencing the full spectrum of its nature in order to correct itself. Anakin was that vessel. His suffering, his rage, his eventual sacrifice were not bugs in the design. They were the mechanism by which balance was restored. This reframes nearly everything about the prequel trilogy. The Jedi Order's confusion about Anakin, their suspicion of his attachment to Padme, their inability to see him as anything other than a problem to be managed, rather than a force of nature to be understood, becomes almost tragic in hindsight. They were trying to mold the universe's balancing mechanism into a compliant soldier, and in doing so, they may have accelerated the very fall they feared. There's a deeper layer here too. If the prophecy was misread by the Jedi for 1,000 generations, then the entire foundation of their order, their rules around attachment, their suppression of emotion, their belief that the dark side could simply be avoided through discipline, was built on a fundamentally flawed premise. The Sith, in their own twisted way, may have understood something the Jedi refused to acknowledge: that the Force is not a binary system to be purified, but a dynamic one to be navigated. Imagine living your entire life as a Jedi, training students for decades under a doctrine that history itself proves to be incomplete. Imagine the quiet horror of Yoda in his exile on Dagobah, slowly coming to terms with the idea that the order he devoted 900 years to may have misunderstood its own founding purpose. There are hints of this in his later dialogue, his admissions to Luke that the Jedi were arrogant, that even the great masters could be wrong. Perhaps this is what he meant. Not simply that they failed to detect Palpatine, but that they failed to understand the very prophecy that gave their order its sense of cosmic purpose. Let that settle for a moment. 1,000 years of tradition, built on a single misreading. It changes how you see every Jedi who ever quoted the prophecy with such confidence, never imagining that the answer was hiding in plain sight, in the word balance itself. From there, let's drift toward a colder, more calculating kind of theory, one that concerns the architect of nearly everything that goes wrong in the saga, Sheev Palpatine. It has often been suggested, half-jokingly, that Palpatine's plan was simply too perfect, that no single mind could have orchestrated the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, the corruption of Anakin Skywalker, and the eventual destruction of the Jedi Order with such precision. But what if his plan was not, in fact, entirely his own? What if Palpatine was less an architect and more a conduit, a vessel through which centuries of Sith strategy, encoded across generations of masters and apprentices, finally found their execution? Darth Bane's Rule of Two was designed for exactly this kind of long game. By limiting the Sith to a master and an apprentice, Bane ensured that Sith knowledge would never be diluted or lost to infighting. Each master would pass on not just power, but strategy, refined and adjusted across centuries. Each apprentice building on the lessons of those who came before. Palpatine inherited this lineage. He inherited Darth Plagueis' research into manipulating midi-chlorians, research that, according to his own account to Anakin, may have led to the creation of life itself. If Plagueis truly could influence the midi-chlorians to create life, then the unusual circumstances of Anakin's birth, a virgin birth with no father, suddenly take on a far darker implication. What if Palpatine, learning from his master's research, orchestrated Anakin's very existence? What if the Chosen One was not a natural development of the Force responding to imbalance, but an engineered being, created specifically so that Palpatine would have access to a weapon of unimaginable power, a weapon he could mold from childhood into the ultimate enforcer of Sith will? This theory recontextualizes the entire prequel trilogy as something closer to a long con played not just on the Jedi and the Republic, but on the Force itself. Palpatine didn't simply exploit the prophecy. He may have manufactured its very fulfillment, ensuring that whatever cosmic balance the Force sought would be delivered directly into his hands, wrapped in the body of a boy from Tatooine, who had no idea he was the culmination of decades of dark side experimentation. Consider the implications for Shmi Skywalker, Anakin's mother, a slave on a remote desert world with no apparent connection to galactic politics. If her pregnancy was engineered through the dark side, then she becomes one of the most tragic and overlooked figures in the entire saga. An unwitting participant in a scheme so vast she could never have comprehended it, raising a child who was never entirely her own creation, but partly the design of a Sith Lord she would never meet. It also explains, in a chilling way, why Palpatine seemed to know exactly which buttons to press with Anakin throughout the films. He wasn't simply a skilled manipulator reading a vulnerable young man. He may have been studying the development of his own creation for years, watching from the shadows as the weapon he engineered grew into the role he had always intended for it. Every conversation between Palpatine and Anakin in the prequels takes on a different texture under this lens. Palpatine isn't seducing a stranger to the dark side. He's checking in on an investment, nudging a project that has been in development since before Anakin could walk. And when Anakin finally turns, when he kneels before Palpatine and accepts the name Vader, the moment isn't simply a betrayal of the Jedi. It's the closing of a loop that began decades earlier in a laboratory of dark side science. We are never shown directly, hinted at only through Palpatine's own retelling of Plagueis' legend, a story he claims is not a story the Jedi would tell, precisely because it is a story only a Sith would have reason to know. Let's slow down and breathe with another idea, one that turns away from grand manipulation and towards something more intimate, the question of what Yoda actually knew and when he knew it. The standard narrative paints Yoda and the entire Jedi Council as blindsided by Palpatine's rise, a council so consumed by political duty and meditation that they failed to see the obvious signs of a Sith Lord operating in their midst for decades. But Yoda is 900 years old by the time of the prequels. He has lived through the fall of countless individuals to the dark side. He has trained generations of Jedi and watched the slow currents of the Force shift and change across centuries most beings could never comprehend. Is it truly plausible that a being of this experience and sensitivity to the Force was simply oblivious? Or is it more likely that Yoda sensed something wrong long before the Clone Wars began, but chose, deliberately, not to act on those suspicions, because doing so would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the Jedi Order's own complicity in the galaxy's slow decay? There is a version of this theory where Yoda's failure is not one of perception, but of will. He felt the darkness growing. He sensed the imbalance creeping into the Force itself. But the Jedi Order, by this point in galactic history, had become so entangled with the bureaucracy of the Republic, so committed to a kind of institutional neutrality, that acting on suspicion without proof would have meant destabilizing the very system the Jedi had sworn to protect. Yoda, in this reading, becomes a tragic figure, not because he was deceived, but because he chose caution over conviction, hoping that the Order's traditions and patience would be enough to weather a threat he could feel but not yet name. This casts an entirely different light on his later exile. When Yoda retreats to Dagobah after Order 66, his isolation is not simply grief or shame at having failed to stop Palpatine. It is penance for a much older failure, the failure to trust his own instincts when it mattered most, the failure to break from tradition and investigate the darkness he had sensed for years, but talked himself out of confronting. There's a particular kind of sorrow in this version of the story. Yoda spends 900 years building a reputation as the wisest being in the galaxy, only to discover, in the final act of his long life, that wisdom without courage is its own kind of failure. His training of Luke takes on new weight under this theory as well. When Yoda insists that Luke must let go of his anger, his fear, his attachment, he is not simply imparting Jedi philosophy in the abstract. He is trying desperately to prevent Luke from repeating his own mistake, the mistake of sensing something true and dangerous, and choosing not to act decisively because the cost of being wrong, or the cost of disrupting the established order, felt too high. And when Luke ultimately defies Yoda's teaching, refusing to kill his father, refusing to abandon hope even when logic suggests it is hopeless, perhaps this is the moment Yoda finally understands what he himself lacked 900 years into his own journey. Conviction, the willingness to act on what you feel to be true, even when every institutional voice around you counsels patience and restraint. There's a quieter, stranger theory that concerns Qui-Gon Jinn, a man whose death in the very first act of the prequel trilogy seems almost incidental in hindsight, a plot device to remove a mentor and clear the path for Obi-Wan's arc. But Qui-Gon's death may be one of the most consequential events in the entire saga, not because of what he did while alive, but because of what he became afterward. Qui-Gon Jinn was the first Jedi in living memory to discover the secret of retaining consciousness after death, the ability to commune with the living as a Force ghost. This was not a power passed down through Jedi tradition. It was something Qui-Gon uncovered on his own, likely through contact with beings on the fringes of Jedi philosophy, perhaps even through forbidden knowledge that brushed up against the kind of immortality the Sith themselves sought through far darker means. If Qui-Gon was the first to crack this secret, then his death was not simply a tragedy. It may have been the beginning of an entirely new kind of Jedi influence on galactic events, one operating from beyond the veil of death itself. Consider how much of Obi-Wan's later behavior aligns suspiciously well with guidance Qui-Gon might have provided from beyond. Obi-Wan's decision to train Luke in secret rather than openly defying the Empire. His insistence on hiding rather than confronting Vader directly for nearly 2 decades. His final choice to allow himself to be struck down by Vader's blade, sacrificing his physical form to become, as he himself says, more powerful than Vader could possibly imagine. This is precisely the path Qui-Gon pioneered. Is it possible that Qui-Gon, watching from beyond, guided Obi-Wan not just in life through memory and training, but through subtle whispers across the years, nudging him toward the eventual choice to embrace death as a form of continued influence? If true, this reframes the entire original trilogy as a story partially orchestrated by a being who has been dead since before the Clone Wars even began. Qui-Gon's fingerprints would be on Luke's training, on the strategic patience of the rebellion's Jedi-adjacent decisions, on the very philosophy of hope and faith in the Force that defines Luke's arc as opposed to Anakin's arc of control and fear. There's something deeply moving about this idea if you sit with it. A man who, in life, was considered a maverick by the Jedi Council. Too unconventional, too willing to trust his instincts over the sanctioned wisdom of the Order, becomes in death an architect of the galaxy's eventual salvation, succeeding precisely because he operated outside the rigid structures that constrained the Jedi while they were alive. Qui-Gon never lived to see Anakin fall, never lived to see the Empire rise, never lived to see Luke born. But if this theory holds, he may be the reason any of them survived to set things right at all. A quiet hand, guiding events from a realm the living Jedi Council never even believed was accessible until it was almost too late to matter. Now let's turn to something colder and more architectural in nature, the Death Star itself. and the question of whether it was ever truly meant to be a weapon of war in the conventional sense. The official explanation is straightforward enough. Tarkin and the Empire built a station capable of destroying entire planets in order to project absolute power and crush any hope of rebellion through sheer terror. But terror weapons, historically, work best when they are used sparingly and strategically. Their power demonstrated just enough to instill fear without inviting desperate, unified resistance. The Death Star's destruction of Alderaan, an act with no immediate strategic justification, a planet with no military presence, destroyed almost casually to make a point to a captured princess, suggests something closer to overkill than calculated strategy. What if the true purpose of the Death Star was never primarily about suppressing the broader galaxy, but about something far more specific, eliminating potential threats to Sith dominance hidden among the galaxy's various planetary systems? Consider how many worlds throughout Star Wars lore are associated with unusually high concentrations of Force sensitivity. Ancient temples, ancient knowledge, or populations with historical ties to the Jedi Order. A weapon capable of erasing an entire planet in seconds would be remarkably effective, not just at crushing rebellion, but at permanently severing any possibility of Force-sensitive resistance ever rising again from specific, targeted locations. Palpatine, who by this point has access to the accumulated knowledge of Sith history regarding Force-sensitive bloodlines, ancient Jedi enclaves, and hidden temples scattered across the galaxy, may have viewed the Death Star not merely as Tarkin's doctrine of fear in action, but as a final solution to a problem that had plagued the Sith for 1,000 years, the persistent, irritating possibility that the light side of the Force could always find new vessels through which to reassert itself. If this is true, then the destruction of Alderaan was never really about Leia, or about sending a message to the rebellion. It may have been the execution of a long-planned strike against a world Palpatine had identified, through means we are never shown, as significant to the Force in ways that threatened Sith permanence. This recasts the entire first Death Star plot, not as a single act of terror, but as the opening move in a campaign of planetary erasure, one interrupted only by Luke Skywalker's unlikely success in the trench run. It also raises an unsettling question about how many other worlds might have been on a similar list. Worlds we never see in the films. Worlds whose destruction was planned but never carried out. Because the first Death Star was destroyed before its mission could continue. The galaxy, under this theory, came far closer to a kind of slow, methodical genocide of Force-sensitive heritage than the films ever explicitly show, hidden behind the more straightforward narrative of imperial terror and rebellion. Tarkin's doctrine of fear may have simply been the convenient cover story, the explanation given to officers and the wider galaxy, while Palpatine pursued his own deeper, more specific agenda underneath it, an agenda concerned not with the suppression of dissent in general, but with the permanent eradication of any seed from which a new Jedi Order might one day grow. There's another theory worth letting drift through your mind before we move further into the night, one that concerns the stormtroopers themselves, the faceless soldiers who populate nearly every battle in the original and prequel trilogies. The common assumption, reinforced by decades of jokes about their poor aim, is that stormtroopers are simply bad shots, comic relief in white armor, who exist to be mowed down by the heroes without consequence. But what if their consistent failure to hit their targets, particularly the protagonists, was never a flaw in the storytelling, but a deliberate, if dark, design choice baked into the Empire's strategy from the very beginning? Consider the pattern across the original trilogy. Stormtroopers consistently fail to hit Luke, Leia, Han, and their allies in situations where, realistically, overwhelming firepower should result in certain death. Meanwhile, the same stormtroopers demonstrate competent, even lethal accuracy against background characters and unnamed rebels throughout the same battles. This selective incompetence becomes far more interesting if we consider who is actually directing these encounters from a strategic level. Palpatine, with his vast knowledge of the Force and his unique ability to sense the currents of destiny moving through key individuals, may have had far more granular control over Imperial operations than the films ever explicitly state. If Palpatine, even subtly, influenced certain engagements to ensure the heroes survived their early scrapes with the Empire, the pattern of suspiciously poor stormtrooper marksmanship around the protagonists specifically suddenly makes a strange kind of sense. Why would Palpatine want Luke Skywalker, a known threat with growing Force sensitivity, to survive his initial confrontations with Imperial forces? Because Palpatine had already begun to suspect, through his connection to the dark side and his awareness of the Skywalker bloodline, that Luke represented an opportunity rather than merely a threat. A Force-sensitive son of Anakin Skywalker, raised in ignorance of his true heritage, was exactly the kind of asset Palpatine could eventually attempt to turn, just as he had turned Anakin decades earlier. Killing Luke prematurely in a random skirmish on the Death Star, or during the escape from Mos Eisley, would have eliminated this possibility entirely. Instead, by allowing Luke and his companions to repeatedly escape situations that should have been fatal, the Empire, whether through direct Force influence from Palpatine or simply through institutional incompetence that Palpatine chose not to correct, ensured that Luke's story could continue long enough for Palpatine to eventually attempt to seduce him to the dark side, mirroring his earlier success with Anakin. This theory transforms the comedic trope of stormtrooper inaccuracy into something far more sinister. Evidence not of poor training, but of a galaxy-spanning game being played by a single but patient mind who understood that some battles were worth losing in service of a longer, more devastating strategy. It also reframes Vader's own behavior during these early encounters. His pursuit of Luke and his companions often seems strangely restrained for a being capable of crushing them outright. Perhaps Vader, sensing his son's presence even before he consciously acknowledged the connection, was already subtly working to ensure Luke's survival, an instinct of fatherhood operating beneath his conscious loyalty to the Emperor, manifesting as orders that somehow always left just enough room for the rebellion to slip away. Let's drift now toward a theory concerning the very nature of the Force itself. Something more cosmic and abstract than the political machinations we've been discussing. What if the Force, rather than being a passive energy field generated by life, as the Jedi traditionally describe it, is in fact a kind of vast, slow-moving consciousness, one that has its own desires, its own sense of narrative, and its own methods of nudging events toward outcomes it finds meaningful? This is a controversial idea even within Star Wars lore, one that brushes up against concepts like the live Force and the cosmic Force. Distinctions made in some of the broader mythology between the Force as it exists in living beings and the Force as it exists as an overarching cosmic entity. If the Force has something resembling intention, then many of the seemingly impossible coincidences throughout the saga begin to look less like narrative convenience and more like the deliberate maneuvering of an entity far more powerful than any single Jedi or Sith. Consider the sheer improbability of the events that bring the original trilogy's heroes together. Luke Skywalker, raised in obscurity on a remote desert world, happens to come into possession of droids carrying information critical to the rebellion's survival. Droids that happen to land in the exact region of Tatooine, where Luke's family resides, who happen to be purchased by Luke's own household. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the one person capable of recognizing R2-D2's message and explaining Luke's heritage, happens to live in exile within walking distance of the Lars homestead. Han Solo, a smuggler with no apparent connection to the rebellion or the Force, happens to be present in the cantina at the exact moment Luke and Obi-Wan require transport off-world, with a ship fast enough to outrun Imperial pursuit and a pilot reckless enough to take the job. Individually, each of these coincidences might be dismissed as narrative convenience, the kind of contrivance audiences accept in service of storytelling. But if the Force is not simply a passive field, but an active participant in galactic events, nudging probability, influencing the timing of seemingly chance encounters, then these coincidences stop being narrative shortcuts and start looking like the Force itself orchestrating the reunion of the people necessary to restore balance. This idea extends further if you consider the role of prophecy throughout the saga. A being capable of generating prophecies that accurately predict events centuries before they occur is not a passive field of energy. It is something closer to a mind. However alien its method of thought might be compared to the linear, causal thinking of mortal beings. Under this theory, characters like Palpatine, for all his cunning, are not truly in control of the galaxy's fate in the way he believes himself to be. He may be, despite his immense power, merely another piece being moved across a board whose true dimensions he cannot perceive, manipulated by the very Force he believes he has learned to dominate through fear and dark side discipline. This recontextualizes his ultimate defeat, not as a failure of strategy, but as an inevitability, the natural correction of a cosmic system that, having tolerated his ambition long enough to allow the necessary lessons to unfold, simply closed the loop once Anakin's redemption became possible. There is something both comforting and unsettling about this idea. Comforting, because it suggests that even in a galaxy ruled by tyrants and shadowed by ancient evils, there exists a deeper current working toward balance and resolution. Unsettling, because it suggests that free will, even for beings as powerful as Palpatine or Vader or Luke himself, may be far more constrained than any of them realize, each of them playing a role written into the fabric of the Force long before they were born. Their choices mattering enormously within the story, yet somehow always bending, eventually, toward the same cosmic conclusion. Let your mind rest on that thought for a while as we move toward another theory, one that returns to more intimate, personal territory. The question of what Padme Amidala actually died from, and whether the official explanation that she lost the will to live was ever the full truth. The films present her death somewhat ambiguously, with medical droids stating that she is physically healthy, and yet she simply fades. as though her body has given up despite no clear injury. This explanation has always struck careful viewers as strange for a character defined throughout the prequels by her resilience, her political conviction, and her refusal to give up, even in desperate circumstances. A woman who survived assassination attempts, war, and the collapse of the republic she devoted her life to does not seem like someone who would simply will herself to death over heartbreak, however profound that heartbreak might be. What if Padmé's death was not psychological at all, but the result of a far darker mechanism, one connected to Palpatine's deep knowledge of the dark side's relationship to life and death? Palpatine tells Anakin the legend of Darth Plagueis specifically in the lead-up to Padmé's death, a story about a Sith Lord who could use the dark side to influence midi-chlorians to create life and prevent death. If such power exists, the inverse must logically also be possible, the ability to drain life force from a being rather than create it. What if Palpatine, anticipating that Padmé's survival posed a risk to his control over Anakin, a tether to Anakin's former life, and Jedi-aligned sympathies that could pull his new apprentice back toward the light, deliberately used dark side power to drain her life force during childbirth, disguising the act as a natural complication, a broken heart? Something Anakin would believe stemmed from his own actions rather than from external manipulation? This theory adds a horrifying new dimension to Vader's later characterization. Throughout the original trilogy, Vader believes, as Obi-Wan allows him to believe, that Padmé died because of his own turn to the dark side, a guilt that festers for decades and contributes to his complete severance from his former identity. If Padmé's death was actually engineered by Palpatine specifically to deepen Anakin's psychological commitment to Vader's identity, to ensure that the guilt of having supposedly killed his own wife would bind him more permanently to the dark side than loyalty or training ever could, then Palpatine's manipulation of Anakin extends even beyond death, reaching into the emotional architecture of his apprentice's entire identity for the next 2 decades. It would mean that the single most devastating loss in Anakin Skywalker's life, the death he believes is entirely his own fault, was in fact one final act of control exercised by his master, a master who understood that guilt is often a far more effective chain than fear. There's a bleak symmetry to this idea. Palpatine creates Anakin through dark side manipulation of the Force, according to the Plagueis legend, and then, years later, ends the life of the woman Anakin loves through that same forbidden knowledge, completing a kind of dark side authorship over the most significant relationships of Anakin's entire existence. Birth and death, both touched by Sith hands, both designed to shape the same vessel into the weapon Palpatine always intended him to become. Let's allow the night to carry us toward a quieter, more philosophical theory now, one concerning Darth Maul and the question of why a Sith Lord trained from infancy for a single, glorious moment of revenge against the Jedi was discarded so quickly, sliced in half and left for dead after barely a handful of scenes. The conventional reading treats Maul's brief appearance as simply a consequence of poor planning on the part of the filmmakers, a striking visual character introduced without enough narrative weight to justify a longer arc. But within the logic of the story itself, Maul's swift defeat may carry a deeper meaning about the nature of Sith training and the philosophy of the rule of 2. Maul was raised from early childhood by Darth Sidious specifically to be a weapon, trained obsessively in lightsaber combat, conditioned to suppress nearly all independent thought, in favor of complete obedience to his master's will. He was, in essence, the perfect apprentice under a very narrow definition of perfection. Unwavering loyalty, devastating physical skill, and an absence of the kind of ambition that might one day threaten his master's position. But this same conditioning may have been Maul's fatal flaw. The Sith philosophy of the rule of two depends on an apprentice who possesses enough independent strength and ambition to eventually challenge and potentially overthrow the master, ensuring that only the most cunning and powerful Sith survive to carry the lineage forward. Maul, trained almost like a soldier rather than a true Sith strategist, lacked the deeper cunning that defines figures like Dooku or Sidious himself. He was a blade, expertly forged, but a blade nonetheless, lacking the political and philosophical depth required to navigate the kind of long-term manipulation that defines successful Sith Lords. His defeat on Naboo, then, was not simply bad luck or an unlucky duel against two Jedi at once. It may have been an inevitable consequence of a training philosophy that prioritized obedience and combat prowess over the strategic depth Sidious himself possessed in abundance. Sidious, watching his apprentice fall, may have understood immediately that Maul's death, while a tactical loss, confirmed something he had perhaps already suspected: that Maul, however impressive his physical abilities, was never going to be the apprentice capable of helping him execute his decades-long plan to dismantle the Jedi Order and seize control of the galaxy. This reframes Maul's later survival and obsession with revenge, chronicled across the animated series that followed his initial defeat, in a particularly tragic light. A being created for a singular purpose discarded the moment that purpose proved insufficient, spends years rebuilding himself, both physically and psychologically, driven entirely by a need to prove his worth to a master who had already, quietly, moved on to other apprentices, other plans, other instruments of his ambition. Maul's entire later arc becomes a meditation on obsolescence, on what happens to a weapon once its wielder finds a sharper blade, and the particular horror of being discarded not through malice, but through simple, cold calculation. There's a related theory worth letting drift alongside this one, concerning Count Dooku, and the question of whether his fall to the dark side was less a betrayal of Jedi principles and more a logical, almost inevitable consequence of flaws the Jedi Order itself refused to address. Dooku was, by all accounts, one of the most skilled and respected Jedi Masters of his generation, a former teacher of Qui-Gon Jinn, a member of the Jedi Council, a being of immense political and philosophical insight. His departure from the Order is often treated as a simple corruption narrative, a powerful Jedi seduced by promises of power, much like Anakin after him. But Dooku's own statements, particularly his attempts to warn Obi-Wan and later Anakin about a Sith Lord controlling the Senate from within, suggest a far more complicated motivation. What if Dooku's turn to the dark side was driven not by a hunger for power, but by a genuine, if ultimately misguided, belief that the Jedi Order had become too complacent, too entangled with a corrupt republic, too unwilling to act decisively against threats it could sense but refused to confront directly? Dooku may have seen, years before the Clone Wars began, the same warning signs Yoda himself may have sensed and suppressed. A creeping darkness within the Senate, a republic rotting from within, a Jedi Order so committed to political neutrality that it had effectively rendered itself powerless to prevent the very catastrophe it was meant to guard against. If Dooku approached Sidious not out of ignorance but out of a desperate, calculated gamble, believing he could use Sith power and political influence to eventually dismantle the corruption he saw within the Republic, even if it meant temporarily aligning with darkness, then his arc becomes less a simple morality tale and more a genuine tragedy of someone trying to fix a broken system through catastrophically wrong means. Of course, Dooku underestimated who he was truly dealing with. Sidious did not need an ally interested in genuine reform. He needed a puppet willing to lend legitimacy and military leadership to a war designed entirely to weaken the Jedi and the Republic simultaneously, setting the stage for the Empire's eventual rise. Dooku, brilliant as he was in matters of politics and combat, may have been just as thoroughly manipulated as Anakin would later become, the crucial difference being that Dooku entered his arrangement believing himself to be the one in control, a far more bitter form of self-deception than Anakin's more straightforwardly emotional fall. His death at Anakin's hands, encouraged and orchestrated by Sidious, specifically to harden Anakin's resolve and demonstrate the supposed necessity of ruthless action, becomes under this theory a kind of grim closing of the loop. One disillusioned former Jedi cut down to accelerate the corruption of the next, each generation of fallen idealists serving as stepping stones for Sidious's true, singular ambition. Let's turn now toward Obi-Wan Kenobi himself, and a theory concerning his long exile on Tatooine that complicates the simple narrative of a broken man hiding from his failures. The common interpretation holds that Obi-Wan retreats to the desert out of guilt and grief, watching over Luke from a distance, waiting patiently for the boy to come of age before guiding him toward his destiny. But there is a colder, more strategic reading available if we consider Obi-Wan's placement specifically on Tatooine, a planet with no formal imperial governance, no Senate representation, a world functionally outside the direct reach of imperial law and bureaucracy. Obi-Wan's choice of hiding place may not have been arbitrary sentiment, a desire to remain near Anakin's family out of guilt, but a calculated strategic decision based on decades of Jedi knowledge regarding the few remaining blind spots in galactic surveillance and control. Tatooine, governed loosely by Hutt crime syndicates rather than direct imperial administration, may have represented one of the only places in the galaxy where a being as recognizable and dangerous as Obi-Wan Kenobi could remain hidden for nearly 2 decades without detection. If this is true, then Obi-Wan's exile was never purely about guilt or proximity to Luke. It may have been the result of careful, almost clinical planning, a Jedi Master applying the same strategic thinking he once used in countless campaigns during the Clone Wars to the much quieter, more patient war of simply surviving long enough to fulfill one final mission. This reading adds weight to Obi-Wan's apparent passivity throughout Luke's childhood. He does not actively train the boy, does not reveal his heritage prematurely, does not intervene in the harsh, demanding life Luke leads under his aunt and uncle's care. Some interpretations frame this as a failure of nerve, a broken man, unable to fully commit to his responsibilities. But if Obi-Wan understood, even years in advance, that any premature action might draw imperial attention to Luke before the boy was old enough or trained enough to survive scrutiny, then his patience becomes a form of extraordinary discipline rather than negligence, the same discipline that allowed him to survive in hiding for nearly 20 years, while one of the most powerful and paranoid rulers in galactic history actively hunted any remaining Jedi across the stars. There's also a more painful layer to this theory, one concerning Obi-Wan's relationship with Owen and Beru Lars. Obi-Wan watches Luke grow up from a distance, presumably checking in occasionally, yet never forming the kind of close bond a mentor might be expected to build with a future student. Some have suggested this distance was deliberate, a way of ensuring that if Imperial forces ever did locate and interrogate the Lars family, they would have genuinely little information to offer about Obi-Wan's activities or Luke's heritage beyond the bare minimum necessary for survival. Under this theory, Obi-Wan's emotional distance from Luke throughout his childhood was not coldness, but protection, a calculated sacrifice of warmth and connection in service of operational security, the kind of decision a soldier makes when the stakes of failure are measured not in personal relationships, but in the survival of an entire galaxy's last hope. Now, let's drift towards something a little stranger. A theory concerning the nature of cloning and identity as it relates to the clone troopers themselves, beings created from the genetic template of the bounty hunter Jango Fett, yet shaped through accelerated growth and intensive conditioning into the disciplined soldiers who would eventually execute Order 66 against the Jedi they had fought alongside for years. The official explanation for the clones' sudden, near-universal compliance with Order 66 centers on the inhibitor chips implanted in their brains, a piece of technology designed specifically to override their loyalty and free will the moment the order was given. But there are lingering questions about how complete this control truly was, and what it suggests about the clones' actual experience of betraying the Jedi they had served beside, fought beside, and in many documented cases, genuinely cared for. If the inhibitor chips functioned as a near-total override of free will, erasing personal judgment in the moment Order 66 was issued, then the clones become tragic figures of a particular kind, soldiers whose bodies were forced to commit atrocities their minds, even briefly, may have resisted or grieved, even as their training compelled obedience. Some clones, like Rex, are shown later to have had their chips removed or malfunctioning, allowing them to resist the order entirely, suggesting that the technology, while powerful, was not infallible across every clone in the Grand Army. This raises an unsettling question about the clones who did comply. Were they simply following orders in the straightforward military sense, or were they, on some level beneath conscious awareness, forced to participate in something their own deeper instincts and relationships would have rejected, had they been given the choice? If this is the case, the execution of Order 66 represents one of the largest-scale violations of bodily autonomy and free will in the entire saga, a betrayal not just of the Jedi by the clones, but of the clones themselves by the very Republic and Sith architects who engineered their existence specifically to ensure their compliance regardless of personal conscience. There's a deep and uncomfortable parallel here to Anakin's own fall. Just as Anakin's choices were shaped by manipulation, fear, and circumstances engineered by Palpatine over years of careful psychological pressure, the clones' final, devastating choice to turn on the Jedi was shaped by literal physical engineering, a chip placed in their brains before they were ever capable of consenting to its presence, ensuring their betrayal regardless of whatever bonds of loyalty and friendship they may have formed with the Jedi generals who led them into battle time and again. The clones, in this reading, become perhaps the most thoroughly victimized beings in the entire saga, denied not just freedom of choice in their creation and their military service, but denied even the basic dignity of choosing. In the most pivotal moment of their existence, whether to honor the relationships they had built or to follow the silent, hidden command embedded in their own biology long before they ever set foot on a battlefield. Let's settle into one final theory before we pause and let this first stretch of the night come to rest. A theory concerning the lightsaber itself and the question of whether the weapon's color has ever truly meant what generations of fans have assumed it means. The common understanding holds that blue and green sabers belong to the light side, signifying the calm, controlled nature of Jedi, who have built their crystals through harmony and meditation, while red sabers belong to the Sith, the color produced when a kyber crystal is forced to bleed through violence and dark side corruption, rather than being naturally attuned by its wielder. This explanation has become so deeply embedded in the broader mythology that it feels almost like settled fact. But consider how thin this distinction actually becomes under scrutiny. Mace Windu wields a uniquely purple blade, a combination that, according to certain interpretations, results from a Jedi who has touched the edges of the dark side without fully succumbing to it, channeling controlled aggression in service of the light. If a color as symbolically loaded as purple can exist as a kind of hybrid, a blend of two supposedly opposite forces coexisting within a single weapon, then the entire premise of color as a clean, moral signifier begins to look less like an absolute law of the Force and more like a convenient visual shorthand that the actual philosophy of the saga complicates at every turn. Consider also the existence of Jedi who, throughout expanded lore, carried yellow blades associated with the Jedi Sentinels, or the rare but documented cases of Jedi using blades closer to white, achieved through a process of purifying a corrupted red crystal back to its natural state. A process intrinsically tied to characters who have walked close to the dark side and returned from it, carrying the scars of that journey forward in the very color of their weapon. If color is not a fixed moral category but a kind of visible record of a wielder's personal journey, their struggles, their compromises, their moments of doubt and recovery, then the entire visual language of lightsabers throughout the saga becomes a much richer text than a simple light versus dark color code. It suggests that the Force itself does not deal in the kind of binary purity the Jedi Order claimed to uphold, but in something closer to a spectrum, where the color of a blade reflects not which side a wielder belongs to in some cosmic ledger, but the specific individual shape of their relationship with the Force, a relationship that for nearly every meaningful character in the saga involves at least some degree of struggle, compromise, or hard-won balance between extremes. Under this reading, even Vader's iconic red blade becomes less a simple marker of villainy and more a kind of visible wound, a permanent record of the violence and corruption he inflicted on his own crystal during his fall. A wound that fittingly is never healed or replaced throughout the entirety of his life as Vader, carried with him right up until the moment he turns against his master to save his son, dying still wielding the very blade that marked his descent into darkness so many years before. There is something quietly poetic in the idea that he never reclaimed a blue blade, never symbolically returned to the Jedi he once was, choosing instead to redeem himself while still carrying the visible evidence of everything he had done. A reminder that redemption, in this galaxy at least, does not require erasing the past, only choosing, in the moment that matters most, to act differently than the years before would have predicted. There's a closely related idea worth sitting with as well, concerning kyber crystals themselves, and the suggestion, hinted at across various corners of the wider mythology, that these crystals are not simply inert technological components, but something closer to faintly living, faintly aware fragments of the Force given physical form. If Kyber crystals possess even a rudimentary sense of attunement to the beings who carry them, choosing their wielders as much as being chosen, then the act of constructing a lightsaber, a ritual every Jedi undertakes as part of their training, becomes something closer to a negotiation between two living things rather than simple craftsmanship. This reframes the violence inherent in Sith lightsaber construction in an even darker light. If a Sith forces a crystal to bleed red through anger and dark side corruption rather than earning its cooperation through patience and harmony, they are not merely altering a mineral's color. They may be committing a kind of small, repeated violence against a fragment of the Force itself, bending something that would naturally resist into a shape it was never inclined to take. Multiply this single act of corruption across 1,000 years of Sith history, every red blade in existence representing another instance of a Kyber crystal forced rather than persuaded into its final form, and the dark side's broader relationship to the Force begins to resemble not just a philosophy of aggression and control, but a literal pattern of domination extended even to objects most beings would never think to consider alive at all. It also recontextualizes the moment in which a cracked, unstable crystal produces a blade that bleeds light along jagged fracture lines, visually unstable in a way few other lightsabers in the saga quite match. If Kyber crystals respond to the genuine internal state of their wielder, then a fractured, sputtering blade is not simply an aesthetic choice meant to signal a less polished generation of dark side training. It may be a literal representation of a crystal in active, ongoing rebellion against the corruption being forced upon it. A small, persistent resistance from the Force itself against a wielder who has never fully committed to the darkness he claims to serve. Foreshadowing, long before the events make it explicit, the redemption that may eventually find him. Let this idea rest in your mind as the night deepens further. The notion that even the smallest, most overlooked details of the Star Wars galaxy, the color of a blade, the structure of a crystal, the unspoken texture of a relationship between mentor and student, might be carrying meaning far beyond what the films ever state outright. Waiting patiently across years and re-watches for someone quiet enough and patient enough to finally notice. Before we let this first stretch of theories settle fully into the quiet, it's worth pausing on a thread that connects nearly everything we've drifted through so far. Whether we're talking about the true meaning of the prophecy, the engineered nature of Anakin's birth, the long, unspoken failures of Yoda's caution, the hidden afterlife influence of Qui-Gon Jinn, the calculated purpose of the Death Star, the suspicious patterns of stormtrooper marksmanship, the question of whether the Force itself moves with intention, the engineered tragedy of Padmé's death, the discarded weapon that was Darth Maul, the disillusioned idealism that doomed Dooku, the quiet strategic discipline of Obi-Wan's long exile, the stolen autonomy of the clone troopers, or the deeper, almost living nature of Kyber crystals and the lightsabers they become. A single pattern keeps surfacing again and again. Nothing in this galaxy is ever quite as simple as it first appears. Every act of villainy conceals a deeper architecture of manipulation reaching back further than anyone in the moment realizes. Every act of heroism conceals a cost, a sacrifice, or a quiet discipline that rarely gets the recognition it deserves. And every relationship, whether between master and apprentice, mentor and student, parent and child, or even a Jedi, and the very weapon they carry, turns out to be more complicated, more fragile, and more meaningful than the surface of the story ever lets on. This is, in some ways, the quiet genius of this entire mythology. It rewards patience. It rewards the kind of slow, careful attention that notices a strange detail in a throwaway line of dialogue and lets it sit for years, turning it over until suddenly, one rewatch later, an entirely new layer of meaning reveals itself. There is no need to resolve any of these theories tonight. No need to decide definitively which ones feel true and which ones feel like elaborate speculation built from shadows and coincidence. The galaxy far, far away has always thrived on this kind of ambiguity, this sense that there is always more beneath the surface, always another layer of intention or tragedy or quiet design, waiting to be uncovered by someone patient enough to look. Let your mind rest now in that space between certainty and mystery, between the stories we've been told and the stranger, deeper stories that might be hiding underneath them. There will be more theories ahead, more threads to follow into the dark corners of this galaxy's long and tangled history. But for now, let the weight of everything we've explored settle quietly into the back of your thoughts. The way starlight settles over a sleeping world, distant and steady and patient, waiting for you to drift, slowly and gently, into sleep. When you're ready, the next stretch of theories will pick up exactly where this one leaves off, drifting further into the unanswered corners of this galaxy, further into the quiet spaces between what the stories show us and what they only hint at, layer after layer, theory after theory, for as long as you need them. Let's pick the thread back up gently, drifting now into another stretch of theories, ideas that have circulated quietly among the most attentive corners of fandom for years, each one asking you to look again at something you thought you already understood. We begin this stretch with a theory concerning Luke Skywalker himself and the strange, almost unsettling pattern of his choices during the original trilogy, choices that, taken together, suggest he may have understood far more about his own destiny far earlier than the films ever explicitly state. Consider the moment Luke first ignites his father's old lightsaber on the Millennium Falcon. Training with a remote under Obi-Wan's guidance, he shows an immediate, almost effortless aptitude, deflecting bolts with his eyes covered, relying entirely on instinct and the Force, in a way that even Obi-Wan finds remarkable for someone with no formal training. This is often treated as simple narrative shorthand, a quick way of establishing that Luke has strong Force potential without spending unnecessary time on the details. But what if this aptitude reflects something deeper? A kind of inherited memory passed down not through teaching but through the Force itself, a faint resonance of Anakin's own instincts and battle experience somehow echoing within his son despite the two of them never having trained together, never having even properly met as father and son until the very end of Luke's journey. There is a recurring idea throughout certain interpretations of the Force that strong bloodlines carry more than simple genetic predisposition towards sensitivity. They may carry something closer to inherited instinct, fragments of skill and intuition passed down across generations, the way certain animals are born already knowing how to swim or fly without ever being taught. If this is true, then Luke's swift mastery of the lightsaber, his uncanny ability to trust his feelings in moments of crisis, his instinctive use of the Force to make the impossible shot on the first Death Star, may not simply be evidence of raw talent discovered and refined through Obi-Wan's brief tutelage. It may be evidence that some part of Anakin Skywalker, the brilliant, reckless pilot who could perform feats no other being in the galaxy could match, was always present within Luke, waiting beneath the surface for circumstances to call it forward. This reframes the relationship between Luke's heroism and Anakin's fall in an interesting way, where Anakin's raw talent, channeled through fear and a desperate need for control, eventually curdled into the ruthless efficiency of Vader. That same raw talent, inherited and reborn in Luke, channeled instead through patience, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption, becomes the very thing that saves the galaxy rather than damns it. Father and son, carrying the same extraordinary potential, shaped by entirely different circumstances and entirely different choices, arriving at entirely different ends. There's something quietly profound in the idea that the same instinct that allowed Anakin to win pod races as a child and dominate in starfighter combat as a young man is the very same instinct that allowed Luke, with barely any formal training, to trust the Force completely in the trench run on the Death Star, closing his targeting computer and relying entirely on feeling rather than calculation, just as his father once might have, before fear and manipulation taught him to rely on control instead. From here, let's drift toward a theory concerning Leia Organa, a character often treated, even within the films themselves, as somewhat secondary to Luke's central Force journey, despite being equally Force-sensitive, equally the child of Anakin Skywalker, equally capable, as later stories confirm, of touching and using the Force in ways that rival her brother's abilities. What if Leia's apparent restraint when it comes to formal Jedi training throughout the original trilogy was never a matter of lesser ability, but a deliberate, conscious choice rooted in a far deeper understanding of what the Force and the galaxy actually needed at that particular moment in history? Luke pursues Jedi training because the galaxy, in a sense, requires a single, mythic hero capable of confronting Vader and the Emperor directly, a figure whose journey mirrors the classic structure of redemption and confrontation the galaxy's broader story seems to demand. But Leia, raised not as a hidden farm girl, but as a princess, actively engaged in the political machinery of resistance from a young age, understood something Luke perhaps never fully grasped: that defeating the Empire required more than a single hero wielding a lightsaber. It required organization, diplomacy, strategy, and the patient, unglamorous work of building and sustaining a rebellion capable of fighting a war on every front simultaneously. Leia's choice to lead through politics and military strategy rather than through formal Force training may not reflect a lack of interest in her own potential, but a clear-eyed recognition that the galaxy needed her skills in that particular arena far more urgently than it needed another Jedi. This casts her later turn toward more active Force training, hinted at in materials beyond the original trilogy, in a fascinating light. It suggests that Leia's relationship with the Force was never one of avoidance or fear, as some surface readings might suggest, but one of careful, strategic prioritization. The same instinct for triage and resource allocation that made her such an effective leader within the rebellion applied equally to her own personal development. She trained when the moment called for it, and devoted herself to other forms of leadership when the moment called for that instead, demonstrating a kind of wisdom about the Force that even some trained Jedi, bound rigidly to tradition and formal doctrine, never quite achieved. There's also a deeper symmetry worth noting here. While Luke's journey mirrors his father's in terms of raw aptitude and instinct, Leia's journey may mirror her mother's far more closely. A leader operating primarily through political acumen and personal courage, rather than overt displays of force ability, carrying forward Padmé's legacy of leadership through conviction and strategy rather than supernatural power. Proving that heroism within this saga was never limited to those who carried a lightsaber, but extended equally to those who carried the weight of leadership, diplomacy, and the quiet, exhausting work of holding a rebellion together against impossible odds. Let's turn now toward a colder, more unsettling theory concerning the nature of the dark side itself, and whether it should truly be understood as a moral category at all, or something closer to a kind of addiction, a self-reinforcing pattern of behavior that, once begun, becomes neurologically and spiritually difficult to escape, regardless of a being's original intentions. The traditional Jedi framing treats the dark side as fundamentally tied to specific emotions: fear, anger, hatred, and the actions those emotions inspire, suggesting that simply avoiding these emotional states is sufficient to remain untouched by darkness. But this framing has always struck careful observers as somewhat naive, particularly given how many fallen Jedi throughout the saga's history describe their descent not as a single dramatic choice, but as a slow, almost imperceptible slide. Each small compromise making the next one easier. Each use of dark side power providing a temporary sense of control or relief that makes returning to the slower, more difficult path of patience and restraint increasingly unappealing. If the dark side functions less like a moral failing and more like a kind of spiritual addiction, then many of the choices made by characters throughout the saga take on a different, more sympathetic texture. Anakin's fall was not simply a matter of insufficient discipline or excessive attachment. Flaws to be corrected through better training. It may have been the predictable outcome of a being placed under extraordinary psychological pressure, repeatedly offered small, seemingly justified uses of dark side power as solutions to genuine crises, each one reinforcing a neural and spiritual pathway that became progressively harder to resist the more it was used. Under this framing, Palpatine's manipulation becomes even more insidious than simple seduction through promises of power. He functions almost like a dealer, carefully calibrating each exposure to the dark side, never offering too much too soon, always ensuring that Anakin experienced just enough relief, just enough sense of control in moments of genuine desperation to make the next small step feel not just acceptable, but necessary. This reframes the entire structure of Sith philosophy as well: the rule of two, the emphasis on secrecy, the careful cultivation of apprentices over years rather than rapid recruitment. All of it begins to resemble less a strategic military doctrine and more the patient, methodical process of cultivating dependency, ensuring that by the time an apprentice fully grasps the nature of what they have become, the pathways back to who they once were have been worn down to the point of near impossibility. It also explains, in a far more compassionate light, why redemption within this saga is treated as such an extraordinary, almost miraculous event, rather than a simple matter of choosing differently. Anakin's return to the light in his final moments is not framed as a simple decision, easily made once the right circumstances align. It is framed as a profound act of will, a single moment of clarity, powerful enough to break through years, even decades, of deeply entrenched patterns. A moment that costs him everything: his strength, his life, in order to finally choose the path he had been unable to choose for so long. If the dark side functions as a kind of addiction rather than a simple moral failing, then every fallen character throughout this saga, Anakin, Dooku, Maul, even minor figures glimpsed only briefly across the wider mythology, becomes a far more tragic figure than the language of villainy typically allows. Each of them caught not simply in a battle between good and evil, but in something closer to a battle against their own neurology, against pathways of relief and control that, once carved, prove almost impossible to abandon without extraordinary intervention or extraordinary cost. Let's drift now toward a quieter, stranger theory concerning the planet Tatooine itself, and the question of why this particular, seemingly unremarkable desert world keeps reappearing at the center of the galaxy's most pivotal events. Anakin is born there. Luke is raised there. Critical confrontations and turning points across multiple generations of the Skywalker saga keep circling back to this single, dusty, sparsely populated world on the Outer Rim, far from the political centers of the Republic and the Empire alike. The conventional explanation treats this as simple narrative convenience, a way of creating thematic symmetry across the trilogies by returning to a familiar setting. But what if Tatooine's recurring significance reflects something deeper about its actual nature within the Force, something the films themselves never explicitly explain, but consistently gesture toward through pattern and repetition? Certain strands of the wider mythology suggest that some locations within the galaxy carry unusually strong connections to the Force, often tied to ancient, mysterious events lost to galactic history. Locations where the Force itself seems to pool or concentrate in ways that influence the beings who live there. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. If Tatooine is one such location, a world whose harsh, unforgiving conditions are themselves somehow tied to ancient disturbances in the Force, ancient battles or rituals or catastrophes buried beneath its endless dunes, then its recurring role in the Skywalker story stops being simple narrative coincidence and starts looking like the inevitable result of powerful Force-sensitive individuals being repeatedly drawn back to a place that, in some deep, barely understood way, calls to them. This would explain why Shmi Skywalker, a slave with no apparent connection to galactic significance, happened to give birth to a child many believe was conceived through dark side manipulation of the midi-chlorians, specifically on a world already steeped in unusual Force activity. It would explain why Obi-Wan, given the entire galaxy to choose from as a hiding place, felt drawn specifically to Tatooine, beyond simple proximity to Luke's family, and it would explain the strange, persistent sense throughout the saga that Tatooine functions less like a random backwater and more like a kind of gravitational center for the Force itself, a place where significant events seem to accumulate not by narrative accident, but by some deeper, unexplained pull that draws the right beings to the right place at the right time over and over again, across generations, as though the planet itself were quietly, patiently orchestrating its own continued relevance to the galaxy's unfolding story. Now let's turn toward a theory concerning the Porg, the Rathtars, the various strange creatures populating the background of this galaxy, and a more serious idea hiding beneath what might initially sound like a frivolous question. What does the treatment of non-sentient and semi-sentient species throughout the saga reveal about the broader moral failures of every major faction? Jedi, Sith, Republic, and Empire alike. Across the films, creatures are casually enslaved, hunted, weaponized, and discarded with little acknowledgement from any of the supposedly heroic factions that this might constitute a meaningful ethical concern. Rancors are kept as pets and execution devices. Wampas are treated as mere environmental hazards. Even the Jedi, an order built explicitly around principles of compassion and respect for all life, rarely, if ever, extend their philosophy of non-attachment and harmony to the countless creatures used, abused, or discarded throughout galactic history. What if this consistent blind spot reflects something genuinely significant about the limitations of Jedi philosophy itself? A philosophy so focused on managing relationships between sentient, Force-sensitive beings that it largely fails to account for the moral status of the countless other forms of life populating the galaxy. This would align with broader critiques some have leveled at the Jedi Order throughout its history. The idea that for all its talk of balance and compassion, the Order remained remarkably narrow in its actual scope of concern, focused almost entirely on political stability, the prevention of Sith resurgence, and the careful management of Force-sensitive individuals, while largely ignoring the broader ethical implications of slavery, animal cruelty, and environmental destruction that ran rampant across the galaxy throughout their watch. Anakin's own childhood as a slave on Tatooine becomes particularly significant under this lens. The Jedi Order, despite claiming jurisdiction over matters of galactic importance, and despite eventually taking Anakin under their wing specifically because of his Force potential, never seriously addresses the broader institution of slavery that defined his early life, an institution that persists openly across the Outer Rim throughout the entire saga, without meaningful intervention from either the Jedi or the Republic they served. This suggests a galaxy-wide moral failure baked into the very institutions meant to provide order and justice. A failure the films rarely interrogate directly, but which becomes increasingly visible the more closely you examine the casual cruelty embedded in the galaxy's everyday functioning, from the treatment of droids, frequently shown experiencing what appears to be genuine fear, pain, and personality, despite rarely being granted moral consideration by the sentient beings around them, to the routine exploitation of alien species across countless background scenes, to the casual brutality inflicted on creatures throughout the saga's various action sequences. Perhaps this is one of the saga's most overlooked and uncomfortable theories, not a question of hidden plot twists or secret manipulations, but a quiet, persistent suggestion that even the supposedly enlightened forces of light within this galaxy, the Jedi, the Republic, the rebellion that follows in their footsteps, operated within and largely accepted a deeply unjust system. Their heroism, real and genuine within the narrow scope the films choose to focus on, yet incomplete in ways the story itself seems only partially aware of. A galaxy far, far away that, for all its wonder and mythic grandeur, remains haunted by the same blind spots and moral compromises that haunt civilizations far closer to home. Let's drift towards something more intimate again. A theory concerning Han Solo, a character often treated as the saga's grounded skeptic, the smuggler who famously doubts the existence of the Force before eventually coming to accept it through the events of his own adventures. But what if Han's skepticism throughout the original trilogy was never genuine disbelief, but a carefully maintained performance, a defense mechanism built from years of operating in a galaxy where believing in destiny, in cosmic purpose, in forces larger than oneself, made a person vulnerable in ways a smuggler living on the margins of galactic society simply could not afford. Han grew up, according to various accounts woven into the wider mythology, in circumstances of poverty and hardship, eventually finding his way into a life defined by self-reliance, quick thinking, and a deep, hard-earned suspicion of anything that asked him to trust in forces beyond his own control. Under this reading, Han's famous insistence that there's no mystical energy field controlling his destiny is not naivety in the face of obvious cosmic truth, but a psychological survival strategy, a way of maintaining the sense of agency and control necessary to survive as an independent operator in a galaxy increasingly dominated by larger ideological forces. The Empire on one side, the Rebellion and its Jedi allies on the other. Believing in the Force, for Han, would mean accepting that his choices matter less than he needs them to matter, that he is simply a piece being moved by currents far beyond his understanding, an idea fundamentally incompatible with the self-made identity he has spent years constructing for himself. This reframes his eventual grudging acceptance of the Force's reality not simply as an updating of his factual beliefs based on new evidence, but as a much deeper, more vulnerable shift in his entire worldview, an acknowledgement that perhaps his life has never been as fully self-authored as he needed to believe, that perhaps some of his most consequential choices, meeting Luke and Obi-Wan in that cantina, returning to help destroy the first Death Star despite his initial intention to take the reward money and leave, were themselves quietly shaped by currents he had spent his entire adult life refusing to acknowledge. There's something deeply moving in this interpretation of Han's arc. The idea that his journey throughout the trilogy is not simply about becoming a hero through circumstance, but about slowly, reluctantly surrendering a hard-won psychological armor, built specifically to protect him from the vulnerability of believing in anything larger than his own immediate survival, a surrender that ultimately allows him to fall in love, to commit to a cause larger than himself, and to become, despite every defensive instinct built over years of hardship, exactly the kind of person capable of genuine heroism and genuine connection that his younger self might never have believed himself capable of becoming. There's a related theory worth considering alongside this one, concerning Lando Calrissian and the particular nature of his betrayal of Han, Leia, and their companions on Bespin, a betrayal often discussed in terms of simple moral weakness or desperate circumstance. Lando making a deal with the Empire to protect Cloud City and its inhabitants from a far worse fate. But there's a more complicated reading available if we consider Lando's position not simply as an individual making a difficult choice under pressure, but as a leader responsible for an entire population of people who trusted him to protect their home, their livelihoods, and their safety. Lando's betrayal, under this reading, becomes less a story of personal moral failure and more a meditation on the genuine, agonizing impossibility of leadership under authoritarian threat, the kind of choice that has no clean resolution, where every available option involves betraying someone's trust, whether it's the trust of old friends or the trust of an entire city's population, depending on his judgment to keep them safe. This reframes Lando's subsequent actions, his decision to help Leia and Chewbacca attempt to rescue Han from Boba Fett, his eventual full commitment to the rebellion by the time of the assault on the second Death Star, not simply as a redemption arc correcting an earlier mistake, but as the natural continuation of a man who has always been trying, however imperfectly, to protect the people under his care, first through compromise with the Empire, when he believed that was the only way to spare Cloud City from destruction. And later, through open rebellion, once he understood, through painful experience, that compromise with the Empire was never a sustainable long-term strategy, that the Empire's promises of protection in exchange for cooperation were never going to be honored in good faith regardless of how thoroughly he complied. Lando's arc, read this way, becomes one of the saga's most realistic explorations of what leadership actually requires under conditions of genuine oppression, the slow, painful process of learning that appeasement rarely produces lasting safety, and that true protection of the people you're responsible for sometimes requires the much harder, much riskier path of open resistance, a lesson many real historical figures have learned, often at great personal and collective cost, throughout the long history of authoritarian rule. Let's move now toward a stranger, more cosmic theory concerning the question of whether the Sith, despite their reputation as agents of pure chaos and destruction, may have actually served an unintentional but vital function within the broader ecology of the Force, a kind of necessary pressure that, however much suffering it caused along the way, prevented an even worse outcome that the Jedi's own philosophy may have been quietly steering the galaxy toward. The Jedi Order, throughout its thousand-year history, increasingly emphasized detachment, the suppression of emotion, and the avoidance of personal attachment as the surest path toward maintaining connection with the light side of the Force. But emotional suppression, when practiced rigidly and without genuine resolution, often produces exactly the kind of buried, unprocessed psychological pressure that eventually erupts in far more destructive ways than if those emotions had been acknowledged and integrated from the start. Consider how many Jedi throughout the saga's broader history fall to the dark side, specifically because their suppressed emotions, denied a healthy outlet within Jedi philosophy, eventually overwhelm whatever discipline had been holding them in check. If the Jedi's approach to emotional regulation was fundamentally flawed, perhaps even quietly self-defeating over centuries of practice, then the existence of the Sith, however monstrous their individual actions, may have served as a kind of necessary check on the Jedi's own potential for stagnation and quiet corruption. A galaxy with only the Jedi, unchallenged and unexamined, operating according to a philosophy of suppression rather than integration, might have eventually calcified into something far more rigid and authoritarian than the relatively open, if imperfect, Republic. The Jedi spent centuries protecting. The Sith, through their very existence as a threat, forced the Jedi to remain vigilant, to continually test and refine their philosophy against an active, dangerous counterpoint, preventing the kind of unchecked institutional stagnation that often afflicts organizations who face no genuine external challenge to their worldview. This doesn't excuse the genuine suffering the Sith caused throughout galactic history. The wars, the betrayals, the millions of lives lost across countless conflicts spanning thousands of years. But it does suggest a more complicated relationship between light and dark within this mythology than the simple narrative of good versus evil typically allows. A suggestion that balance, in the deepest sense the Force seems to value, may require not the elimination of darkness, but the maintenance of genuine tension between opposing forces, each one preventing the other from drifting too far toward its own particular form of corruption. Whether that's the Sith's descent into pure chaos and selfish ambition, or the Jedi's quiet drift toward rigid, emotionally repressive dogma, increasingly disconnected from the messy, complicated reality of the beings they claim to serve and protect. Let's settle now into a theory concerning the nature of Force ghosts. Building further on the earlier idea about Qui-Gon Jinn's pioneering discovery of this technique, and asking a stranger, more unsettling question. If Jedi can achieve a kind of continued consciousness after death, by maintaining their individual identity within the Force, why do we never see equivalent manifestations from the Sith, despite the dark side being, by the film's own internal logic, equally capable of granting power over life and death? As demonstrated explicitly through the legend of Darth Plagueis, one possible answer lies in the fundamental philosophical difference between how Jedi and Sith relate to the Force itself. Jedi philosophy emphasizes becoming one with the Force at the moment of death, a kind of willing surrender of individual ego in service of a connection to something larger than oneself. A surrender that, paradoxically, seems to be precisely what allows certain, especially disciplined or insightful Jedi to retain a faint thread of individual consciousness even after that surrender. Perhaps because the act of letting go without resistance allows the Force to gently preserve what the practitioner has chosen not to desperately cling to. Sith philosophy, by contrast, is built almost entirely around the accumulation and preservation of individual power, identity, and control, a philosophy fundamentally opposed to the kind of surrender that seems to enable the Force ghost phenomenon among the Jedi. This would suggest that Sith attempts to cheat death, whether through Plagueis' rumored research, through Palpatine's later, more desperate attempts to transfer his consciousness into cloned bodies, or through other dark side rituals scattered throughout the wider mythology, represent a fundamentally different and ultimately less successful approach to the same underlying problem, one rooted in clinging and control rather than surrender and trust, and therefore one that, however much raw power it might temporarily produce, can never achieve the same quiet, stable continuity that the Jedi method allows. This casts Palpatine's ultimate fate in an interesting light. Despite being, by any measure, one of the most powerful Force users in galactic history, his obsessive pursuit of immortality through control and dark side ritual, his desperate attempts across various points in the wider saga to extend his life through unnatural means, may reflect a fundamental, almost ironic limitation built into the very philosophy he embraced, a philosophy so committed to control and domination that it inadvertently locks its practitioners out of the one form of genuine continuity, the Force ghost, that figures like Qui-Gon, Yoda, and eventually Obi-Wan and Anakin himself managed to achieve simply by finally, at the moment of death, letting go of the need to control their own fate any further. Let's drift toward a quieter, more structural theory now. Concerning the architecture of the Jedi Temple itself and what its physical design might reveal about the Order's deeper, often unspoken anxieties. The temple, towering at the heart of Coruscant, is frequently depicted as a place of serene contemplation, vast halls and meditation chambers designed to foster calm and connection with the Force. But consider how the temple also functions, quite deliberately, as a place of separation, removing Force-sensitive children from their families at the earliest possible age, raising them within an insular community shaped almost entirely by Jedi doctrine, with minimal exposure to the wider galaxy's cultures, relationships, and emotional complexities, until they are already deeply indoctrinated into the Order's particular worldview. This pattern, when examined closely, begins to resemble less the gentle spiritual nurturing the Jedi present it as, and more a structure explicitly designed to prevent exactly the kind of attachment and emotional complexity that the Order considers dangerous. Not through teaching young Jedi how to integrate those emotions healthily, but by removing the conditions under which those emotions might develop in the first place. Anakin's case becomes particularly illuminating here, precisely because he is the rare exception, a child brought into the Order at 9 years old rather than as an infant, old enough to have already formed a deep bond with his mother, old enough to remember vividly the home and the suffering he left behind on Tatooine. The Jedi Council's anxiety about training him, frequently framed within the films as concern about his unusually strong connection to the Force and the fear in his heart, may actually reflect a much simpler, more uncomfortable truth. Anakin was the first real test case in living memory of what happens when someone enters the Order already shaped by ordinary human attachment, and the Council, lacking any real framework for integrating that attachment, rather than simply suppressing it, had no effective tools to help him process what he was experiencing. This suggests that the Jedi's failure with Anakin was never simply a personal failure of individual judgment on the part of Yoda, Mace Windu, or Obi-Wan, but a structural failure baked into the entire system of how the Order trained its members. A system built around early separation and suppression that worked, perhaps, for those who entered the temple too young to remember anything different, but which had no answer at all for someone who arrived already carrying the full weight of human connection and loss. If this reading holds, then the entire tragedy of Anakin's fall becomes not an aberration, but a kind of inevitable stress test, revealing a fundamental flaw in Jedi training methodology that had simply never been exposed before, because the Order had for centuries been careful enough, or perhaps lucky enough, to avoid training anyone old enough for that flaw to matter. There's a connected idea worth exploring here concerning the broader question of why the Jedi Order, across 1,000 years of recorded history, produced relatively few truly transformative philosophical innovations, relying instead on a body of doctrine that remained largely static across countless generations of masters and Padawans. If the temple's structure actively discouraged the kind of deep emotional and experiential engagement with the wider galaxy that often drives genuine philosophical growth and adaptation, removing children at an age before they could develop independent perspectives shaped by life outside the Order, then the Jedi's intellectual stagnation across the centuries becomes less surprising and more like the predictable result of an institution that had, in a very real sense, optimized itself for the preservation of existing doctrine rather than its evolution. Compare this to figures like Qui-Gon Jinn, frequently described throughout the films and wider mythology as unconventional, willing to question Council doctrine, more attuned to the living, unpredictable nature of the Force than many of his more orthodox peers. Qui-Gon's unconventional approach to the Force, his willingness to trust the living Force over rigid doctrine, may stem precisely from spending more time outside the temple's insular structure than most Jedi of his generation, exposed to a wider range of cultures, philosophies, and experiences that allowed him to develop a more nuanced, less doctrinaire understanding of the Force than his Council colleagues who spent the majority of their lives within the temple's carefully controlled environment. This casts the Jedi Order's eventual downfall in an even broader light. Their failure to detect Palpatine's manipulation, their failure to adequately address the structural issues that contributed to Anakin's fall, their general inability to adapt their philosophy to the rapidly changing political and social realities of the late Republic era, may all trace back to the same underlying cause: an institution so thoroughly insulated from outside challenge and perspective that it had lost the capacity for genuine self-examination and reform, a slow institutional ossification that left them dangerously unprepared for a threat as patient, adaptive, and fundamentally modern in its strategic thinking as Darth Sidious ultimately proved to be. Let's turn now towards something a little different. A theory concerning Boba Fett and the broader culture of the Mandalorians, asking what the persistence of Mandalorian identity and tradition across centuries of galactic upheaval might reveal about alternative ways of relating to power, honor, and survival that stand in quiet contrast to both the Jedi and Sith philosophies that dominate so much of the saga's central conflict. The Mandalorians, unlike the Jedi or Sith, build their identity not around mastery of the Force, but around a code of honor, craftsmanship, and communal resilience that allows their culture to survive catastrophic defeats, near-extinction events, and centuries of displacement, while still maintaining a coherent sense of who they are and what they value. This resilience stands in sharp contrast to the Jedi Order, which, for all its supposed wisdom and connection to a cosmic energy field, is essentially destroyed within the span of a single coordinated strike. Order 66 unraveling 1,000 years of tradition and training in a matter of days. What does it mean that a culture built around armor, craft, and chosen family, rather than connection to a mystical force, proves ultimately more durable across the long arc of galactic history than an order built around supposedly transcendent spiritual power? One possible reading suggests that the Mandalorian approach to identity, rooted in practice, community, and adaptable tradition, rather than rigid doctrine or dependence on individual extraordinary ability, represents a fundamentally more sustainable model of resilience than either the Jedi or Sith ever achieve. The Jedi's strength depends entirely on training a small population of Force-sensitive individuals, a strength that becomes a catastrophic vulnerability the moment that small population is targeted directly, as Order 66 demonstrates with horrifying efficiency. The Sith, even more narrowly, depend on a lineage of exactly 2 individuals at any given time, a strength in terms of secrecy that becomes an existential vulnerability the moment either master or apprentice is killed without a successor in place, as nearly happens multiple times throughout Sith history. The Mandalorians, by contrast, distribute their cultural strength across an entire community bound by shared practice and values rather than rare individual ability, meaning that even catastrophic military defeats, and the Mandalorians suffer several throughout galactic history, never fully extinguish their culture the way Order 66 nearly extinguishes the Jedi in a single devastating night. This suggests a quiet but significant thematic argument embedded within the broader saga, one that values communal, adaptable tradition over concentrated, doctrine-bound power, a lesson that Din Djarin's later journey and his gradual embrace of a more flexible, less dogmatic understanding of what it means to be Mandalorian only reinforces further, suggesting that the most resilient forms of identity and culture within this galaxy are not the ones built around rigid purity or transcendent individual power, but the ones flexible enough to adapt, reform, and rebuild themselves generation after generation without losing their essential core. Let's drift now toward a more melancholy theory concerning Anakin Skywalker's relationship to flight and machinery throughout his life, and what this particular thread, woven consistently from his childhood pod racing on Tatooine through his service as a starfighter pilot during the Clone Wars, to his final transformation into a being more machine than man as Darth Vader, might reveal about his deepest, most persistent psychological need. From his earliest appearance in the films, Anakin is defined by an extraordinary, almost supernatural connection to machines. Building C-3PO from scrap parts as a child, piloting pod racers with reflexes that should be impossible for a boy his age, eventually becoming one of the greatest starfighter pilots the Republic has ever seen. This consistent thread suggests that machinery, for Anakin, represents something far more significant than simple technical skill or hobby. It may represent the one domain in his life where he experiences genuine, uncomplicated control, a sharp contrast to nearly every other aspect of his existence, defined by slavery in his childhood, by the suffocating restrictions and expectations of Jedi training in his adolescence, by the political and personal compromises forced on him throughout his service in the Clone Wars. When Anakin is behind the controls of a pod racer or a starfighter, he experiences a kind of mastery and freedom unavailable to him anywhere else in his life, a domain where his extraordinary talent translates directly and immediately into tangible success and control, without the complicated emotional negotiations required by relationships, politics, or Jedi doctrine. This makes his eventual transformation into Vader, a being whose body becomes literally fused with mechanical components, sustained by a suit that is simultaneously a prison and a kind of armor, almost unbearably tragic when read through this lens. Vader represents the final, horrifying culmination of Anakin's lifelong relationship with machinery as a source of control and identity, except that where pod racing and starfighter combat once represented freedom and mastery, the mechanical components keeping Vader alive after his catastrophic injuries on Mustafar represent something closer to the opposite, a body now entirely dependent on machinery, not for freedom, but for basic survival. Every breath mediated through technology, every movement constrained by the very suit that keeps him alive. The boy who once found his deepest sense of control and identity through machines becomes, in the cruelest possible irony, a being who has lost nearly all control over his own physical existence, kept alive by the very category of technology that once represented his greatest source of freedom and self-expression. There's a particular poignancy. Then, in the moment Vader finally removes his mask in his final scene, choosing, for the first and only time since his transformation, to set aside the machinery that has defined and constrained his existence for over 2 decades, allowing his son to see his actual face, his actual humanity, free from the mechanical prison that had become almost synonymous with his identity. A final act of reclaiming, even briefly, even at the literal cost of his life, the kind of authentic selfhood that machinery once granted him as a free and gifted child on Tatooine. Before slavery, before the Jedi, before Palpatine, before everything that eventually transformed his greatest gift into his most profound and lasting wound. Let's settle into one more substantial theory before we begin winding this stretch of the night toward its close. A theory concerning the nature of prophecy itself within this galaxy, and whether the very act of believing in a prophecy might be partially responsible for bringing that prophecy into being, a kind of self-fulfilling spiritual mechanism the Jedi never fully understood despite building so much of their philosophy around prophetic interpretation. Consider how thoroughly the prophecy of the Chosen One shapes the behavior of nearly everyone connected to Anakin Skywalker throughout his early life. Qui-Gon becomes convinced, almost instantly, that the boy he discovers on Tatooine is the fulfillment of ancient prophecy, and this conviction shapes every subsequent decision he makes regarding Anakin's training and importance. The Jedi Council, skeptical but unable to fully dismiss the possibility, treats Anakin throughout his training with a particular mixture of suspicion and elevated expectation that no ordinary Padawan would experience, a treatment that itself shapes Anakin's psychological development. His sense of being simultaneously special and distrusted, simultaneously destined for greatness and perpetually failing to live up to expectations he never fully understood or consented to. Palpatine, perhaps more than anyone, understands the power of this prophecy and uses it explicitly as a tool of manipulation, framing Anakin's path toward the dark side, specifically through the language of destiny, suggesting that only through embracing his full power the Jedi supposedly fear and suppress, can Anakin truly fulfill what the galaxy itself requires of him. Under this reading, the prophecy doesn't simply describe a sequence of events that would have happened regardless of anyone's beliefs about them. It actively shapes those events by creating a psychological framework within which everyone around Anakin, the Jedi, Palpatine, and eventually Anakin himself, interprets his choices and his significance, channeling an enormous amount of attention, expectation, fear, and manipulation onto a single individual, specifically because of a story everyone has chosen to believe about him. This raises an uncomfortable question about the nature of prophecy more broadly within this mythology. Perhaps prophecies within the Star Wars galaxy function less like objective predictions of a fixed future and more like powerful narrative attractors, stories repeated and believed by enough Force-sensitive individuals that the Force itself, responsive in some fashion to belief, intention, and collective expectation, begins to bend probability and circumstance toward fulfilling what has been so thoroughly anticipated. If this is true, then the Jedi Order's careful preservation and transmission of the Chosen One prophecy across 1,000 years of history was not a neutral act of historical record-keeping. It was, in a very real sense, planting a seed that would eventually grow into exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-pressure situation that made Anakin's fall and his complicated path to redemption almost inevitable. The prophecy creating the very conditions necessary for its own fulfillment, regardless of whether the original prophecy, in whatever ancient form it first emerged, was ever meant to be taken as literally and consequentially as the Jedi eventually came to treat it. There's something both beautiful and unsettling in this idea. The notion that stories themselves, particularly stories believed deeply enough by enough people, connected to a force as responsive and mysterious as the one that binds this galaxy together, possess a kind of quiet power to shape reality simply through the weight of collective conviction, a power the Jedi spent centuries studying without ever fully grasping that they themselves, through their reverence for prophecy, may have been quietly authoring the very future they were trying so desperately to interpret. As we let this stretch of theories settle now into quiet, it's worth noticing how many of these ideas, however speculative, keep circling back to the same handful of deeper truths about this galaxy and the beings who populate it. Power, whether wielded by the Jedi, the Sith, or the countless other factions scattered across the stars, always carries hidden costs. costs that the official stories rarely acknowledge directly, but that linger quietly in the details, the discarded weapons, the suppressed grief, the structural failures dressed up as personal ones. Identity, whether built around the Force, around armor and tradition, around the controls of a starfighter, or around the patient, unglamorous work of leadership, proves far more fragile and far more meaningful than any single label or title can capture. And destiny itself, so often treated within this saga as something fixed and inevitable, repeatedly reveals itself instead as something closer to a story, powerful precisely because it is believed, shaped as much by the choices and convictions of those caught within it as by any cosmic plan written in advance. There's no need to resolve any of this tonight. Let these ideas drift alongside you as your thoughts continue to slow. Each theory a small, quiet thread woven into the larger tapestry of a galaxy that has always rewarded patience, curiosity, and the willingness to look just a little closer at the details everyone else rushes past. Somewhere out past the reach of ordinary thought, that galaxy is still there, still turning, still keeping its secrets close, waiting, as it always has, for those quiet enough and patient enough to keep listening. There's one last thread worth pulling on before we let the silence take over completely. A quieter, more personal theory concerning the question of why so many of this galaxy's most consequential figures, Luke, Leia, Anakin, even Rey in later years, find themselves drawn back, again and again, to places of isolation, deserts, swamps, remote islands cut off from the rest of galactic civilization, in order to confront the truths that matter most. It would be easy to read this simply as a stylistic preference, the kind of visual and narrative shorthand filmmakers reach for when they want to stage a moment of reflection away from the noise of battle and politics. But there's a more interesting possibility hiding in this pattern, one suggesting that the Force itself, or perhaps simply the nature of genuine self-understanding within any mythology built around inner transformation, requires a kind of deliberate removal from the ordinary current of events before its deepest truths can be heard at all. Luke needs Dagobah's stillness before he can begin to grasp what real mastery of the Force requires. Rey needs the isolation of Ahch-To before Luke, and later her own confrontation with her past, can begin to clarify who she actually is beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Anakin, by contrast, almost never receives this kind of deliberate isolation, pulled constantly from one crisis to the next throughout the prequels, never given the quiet space necessary to process grief, fear, or doubt before the next demand on his attention arrives. Perhaps this absence of stillness in Anakin's life is not incidental, but central to understanding why his fall unfolds the way it does. A being capable of extraordinary power, never given the conditions necessary to develop the kind of inner clarity that isolation and reflection seem to provide everyone else in his bloodline, remains perpetually reactive, perpetually swept along by whatever crisis is most immediately in front of him, never quite able to step back far enough to see the larger pattern Palpatine is so carefully orchestrating around him. If this reading holds, then the quiet, unglamorous moments of retreat scattered throughout this saga, an exile on a swamp planet, a meditation in a desert hut, a solitary walk along sea cliffs on a forgotten island, are not simply pauses in the action included to vary the pacing of the story. They may represent something the saga keeps insisting on, almost stubbornly, again and again across generations. That real understanding, real clarity, the kind capable of resisting manipulation and making genuinely free choices rather than simply reacting to whatever pressure is currently being applied, requires distance, requires silence, requires exactly the kind of patient, undistracted stillness that a galaxy constantly at war, constantly in crisis, makes so difficult to find. Perhaps that is part of why this particular mythology has resonated with so many people across so many years. The recognition, buried beneath the lightsabers and starships and sweeping orchestral themes, that even amid the largest, most dramatic conflicts imaginable, the truths that matter most are often found only in stillness, in retreat, in the quiet spaces between battles where a person finally has room to hear their own thoughts clearly enough to choose, freely and deliberately, who they actually want to become. Let that thought rest with you now, gently, as the galaxy far, far away continues turning somewhere beyond reach, its secrets still scattered across deserts and swamps, and the quiet corners of countless untold stories, patient as always, waiting for nothing more than your continued, unhurried attention whenever you're ready to return to it.